recording. And let's see. I am sharing. Cool. And as always, let me just pull up the Zoom chat real quick. Sorry, the interface is a little hidden. Cool. Chat is up. Hold on a sec. Cool. Chat is up. Zoom is up. We're recording. I'm sharing. So we should be in decent shape. If there's any technical snags, feel free to just kind of shout it out real quick, and I'm happy to chat. And again, folks in person, folks on Zoom, if you have just sort of general questions, always feel free to ask. And again, on Zoom, even though it might seem weird, do not hesitate to simply, unmute yourself and say, "Hey, Ian, I have a question," because while I glance over at Zoom periodically, I'm not focused on it. So yeah, it helps me. Cool. So what I want to do real quick is talk about something kind of simple, but something that's certainly going to be relevant for a lot of work that we may do. I'm just going to create a default file real quick. And I'm going to take our default cube that we've worked with many times in the past and just scale it a little bit. I'm going to smush this guy down and maybe stretch it out a little bit like so. Nothing too crazy, but just, little cubey guy, little rectangle. And what I want to do is I want to rotate this object, but I don't want to rotate it in sort of a normal fashion, right? Like we know how that works. We select an object, and we can rotate it like so. What I want to do is start working with this object in sort of a different sense. So when an object rotates, it's going to rotate from its origin point. And if you've worked with other programs before, excuse me, not COVID, we know that objects rotate from, generally speaking, their center point. Whether we're rotating an object in Illustrator, we're rotating an object in Photoshop, After Effects, you name it, Blender, right? Objects tend to rotate from the center. And that's great if that's what we intend, but I'm sure there's going to be occasions where we want something to rotate, maybe almost like from a hinge or something, not from the center, but from, kind of one edge of it. And we can certainly set that up. So what I'm going to do here is if we right click on our object, you'll see in there that we have the ability to adjust or set the origin point of an object. It's a tiny bit tricky to kind of see the difference between them, but our origin point is not the crosshair with the red and white dotted line, but instead is the little orange point in the middle of our object. And those two things are separate from one another. The circle is actually our cursor point. We worked with that a little bit in the past. Generally speaking, when objects spawn in our project, they are created at that cursor point, wherever it's located. The default location for the cursor is the 000 location within our scene. And so again, that's a pretty easy thing to understand. To get back to 00, obviously I moved mine off to the side. What I need to do here is just go to my side menu. Man, I've got a real tickle in my throat. I'm getting really nervous. We've got this little side panel over on the side. I've got this expanded out. I'm down in view right now. And that final option under view, we can go down to 3D cursor. And all I need to do if I want to set that back to kind of its original point is go in and set those all to 0, sort of for X, Y, and Z in there. That sets me back to the original point. But when I moved my cursor, again, you'll probably notice that the little orange dot in the middle of this object still remains. And again, that's the origin point for something, right? And so if I select my object and rotate it again, it doesn't matter if my cursor is somewhere off on the side, my object is going to rotate from that point. So the first thing we need to do is sort of identify where the origin point is for an object before we can go in and start manipulating it. So real quick, I'm just going to set my 3D cursor back to the 0 point. And what I want to do now is move this origin. We could do so by right-clicking and setting origin. There's a couple of different options in here. The one that actually is the most convenient, at least in my opinion, for kind of shifting this, is to use the cursor, right? So like I can move my cursor somewhere and then set my origin point to that location. So I could like throw it over here, and then I can right-click on my object and then set the origin to my 3D cursor. That work, kind of. Set origin. Sort of, not really. Why doesn't that work? I don't know. We'll do that again. What I'm going to do here is take my cursor, enable snapping. Right? We've worked with snapping before too. And what I want to do while I'm snapping is set my snap value. That's just the magnet tool. And I'm going to set the magnet tool to edge mode right up here. If I'm moving my cursor around and I have it set to snap on edges, I could basically get the origin to follow that edge. Now let's see, it was being a little picky before. There it goes. I don't know why it wasn't working a second ago. But as we can see, again, I moved my 3D cursor and I had my 3D cursor set to snapping along edges so that it hugged that edge right there. Once my 3D cursor was right on that edge, then I right-clicked, chose Set Origin to 3D Cursor. And as we can see now, that little orange dot is indeed right where my 3D cursor was. And that's now my new rotation point for this object. And so at this point in time, if I switch back to my rotation tool and rotate it along that particular axis, my object will indeed rotate off of that origin point as opposed to its center point. And again, the benefit now to that is I have, again, a simple animation, or not a simple animation, but a simple motion path where my object behaves differently than it did in its default state. So it's kind of a small thing, but obviously this is something that'll certainly come up. There's a number of different examples where being able to rotate and pivot objects off of other points besides their sort of default centralized origin is going to be useful. Yeah.
Question.
Of course, what's up?
Can you center that point in the middle of the edge? How would you do that? Is it already centered?
So what I would do is we could go back in. I would probably go to a top view. I would switch back to a point there and kind of get that lined up as close as I can, sort of visually first. And then what I would do is sort of pay attention to what value is changing as I'm sliding across here. And if we look over on the side, what that's doing is it's changing my X value in there. If I get close-ish, I could tell that 0 is that start point. And what I could do is just sort of manually set my 3D cursor to 0, which means it is going to be centered. And then once I've done that, if I go in and set my origin to the 3D cursor again, it should get me right on the edge and right in the center of my object.
Awesome, thank you.
Yeah, thanks for asking. And then yeah, it still rotates exactly where it needs to and everything like that. So what I want to do next is just kind of briefly scratch the surface on something. We're gonna come back to this at other points throughout the day, but this is, I think, a good opportunity to do a tiny bit of animation. Now that we have a door or a latch or a shutter or whatever the heck it is that can rotate, let's do a little animation of it rotating. So by default, we should have a timeline at the bottom of our Blender interface. I'm just kind of scrolling that up a little bit so I have a tiny bit more room. Yeah, let's go ahead and make something happen here. So on our timeline, it's based in frames, and the default length of our animation is going to be 250 frames. We can change what our frames per second are when we render our project. So unlike in After Effects, if you're familiar with that program, where the default is 30 frames per second, you know, okay, well, if I've got a, a 240 frame or 250 frame project, I'm dealing with like 8 1/3 of a second here. We can determine the frame rate, meaning this timeline doesn't really mean anything in terms of duration yet. However, I would say that we should all kind of have our standards and sort of default mode that we work under for frame rate, and thus even if we can change this, you'll sort of generally know what you want to work with. So what I'm getting at is, in the back of our mind, we should have a frame rate sort of ready to go. 30 frames per second is certainly a standard one. The math is easy on that, and if that's what you want to continue working with, great. But again, 24 frames per second is also a pretty standard one also. That has a good clarity to it, is standard across a lot of different mediums, and will work well here. So I'll typically work at 30 frames per second. So when I say like, oh, frame 30 is 1 second worth of time, the math on that shakes up. If you're working under like 24 frames per second, if you're trying to create a 1 second long animation, you would just position your playhead somewhere else for that. So what I want to do is I want to have my playhead, this little blue marker, set back at the 0 frame mark. So my playhead is basically back at the beginning of my timeline. And my object is still laying flat. The origin point is where I needed it. The object is laying on its side. Actually, it's at a tiny bit. Where is it? No, it seems like it might be a smidge flat there. Let's see. Yeah, it's like 2 degrees off. So I'm just going to go in, set that back to an even 0 degrees so that it is truly laying flat. It wouldn't have mattered if it was off for this demo, but still. Cool. So my object is laying flat. Everything's good at the beginning. And what I'm going to do to animate this is just go to the property that I plan on changing, right? And this is kind of the same thing you'll do in pretty much any animation or motion graphic program, right? Like, you have an object that you want to do something with, and in your mind, you know what you want to do. Like, I want to have this open up or kind of hinge open. So with that, I know that the property that I'm going to be animating is rotation, right? And my object is set the way that I want it to be at the beginning, right? I want it completely flat at 0 frames or 0 seconds. So what I'm going to do now that my object is configured the way I want it to be at that point, I'm just going to go over to these properties, my rotation properties in this case. If you can't find them, it's just under the Object Properties tab, over on the side, little square right there. And with that rotation set of values selected, I'm just going to right-click and choose that very first option, Insert Keyframe, right? Again, something that we're also familiar with if you've ever used any sort of animation programs in the past. So again, I just selected my, my values there for rotation, right-click, insert a keyframe. And keyframes, if you haven't really ever worked with animation tools before, is simply a device that remembers an object's properties at a certain point in time. So right now, all of us are in some location. We're in a classroom on campus, we're in our bedroom, maybe we're in our living room, we're at work, we're all somewhere right now. And so technically speaking, we all have a location. We all have like a GPS location, latitude, longitudinal coordinations. Technically, we have an elevation, right? So we all have an X, Y, and Z coordinate to ourselves right now. And if I were to add a keyframe for all of you, right, that keyframe would remember where you are right now. But then, like, let's say I closed my eyes or just like took a nap or something like that, and woke up an hour later and you were somewhere else, right? Like, so I've got the original location that you were in, but now I'm using a new current location in an hour, right? So I know where you were and where you are. And with an animation program, what we can do with those two pieces of data, where you were, where you are, or where a thing is and where a thing goes, we can create an animation out of that. So I have my keyframe set up, logging basically my object's rotation properties at the 0 frame mark. And so all I have to do to finish that brief little animation is move to a slightly later point in time on the timeline. It could be frame 30, 50, 60, doesn't really matter. And all I'm going to do once I move my keyframe or my playhead to that location, what I'm going to do is rotate my object to some different value. So now my object is right here. Now that I've rotated my object to some different amount at a later point in time on the timeline, I'm just going to go back to my rotation properties, right click again, and insert keyframes. And in doing so, After Effects should create a new keyframe for me at that location and record my object's properties as they exist at that later point in time. So I kind of just manually dragged it in, get super accurate with anything. But so, 50 frames later, my object is at an angle of 136 degrees. At the very beginning, it was at an angle of 0. So Blender knows, okay, at the 0 frame mark, my object was like this. At the 50 frame mark, my object is like this. So I'm just going to fill in the blanks and create a small little animation of that object moving from point A to point B. And I could scrub the playhead back and forth to get a sense of that animation and how it's going to play out. I can hit the space bar, and it should also give me a representation of what that animation is going to look like as well. Remember, I could do that from sort of any perspective. If I want to see what it's going to look like in my camera, I've got to switch to my camera mode. Obviously, if I need to from there, I could zoom out or whatever else. So maybe I'll do that. Just kind of zoom out a little bit and move the camera so that it's more in frame. And now when I view the project, get it all in. Maybe a tiny bit more up from there. And yeah, basic little animation, but the potential for that is, of course, huge, right? And we'll get more practice with it today in class. Just like any other animation program, you create a keyframe to tell the program how you want an object to be recorded at a certain point in time. And then you just go to a later point in time, change the object, and then apply a keyframe for that change. One thing to note with that is it does require, like you're adding keyframes on those same properties, right? So like if I do rotation at the beginning, but then position later on, I don't have keyframes that are consistent between those two properties, right? So if I know I'm going to be moving an object, I need to do position at the beginning and position sometimes later. If I know I'm going to be rotating, and I need to do rotation at both of those points. So maybe real quick, we'll do like a small little position one as well. I'm going to move my playhead back to the beginning. Once my playhead is back at the beginning point, I'm going to maybe scoot the object just off screen a little bit or outside of the view of my camera, just like so. And from there, I will right click on the location properties, just these ones right here, right click, insert a keyframe. And then what I could do is move to a later point in time on my timeline. Maybe right there is good. And what I'm going to do is move my object back into the scene. And then just like before, right click, insert keyframe. And so my object now moves into the screen while it's rotating into the screen as well. So hopefully that's a pretty easy segue into kind of the first steps in creating animation within Blender. Not too terribly difficult, but obviously worth knowing. From here, I'm going to switch out of my camera view so I can kind of freely move around my scene, do whatever I want to, and not worry about things too much. So next, actually, any questions on rotation or sort of like those very basics of animation right there? Cool. So the next thing I want to do, I'm actually going to delete this poor little door, this poor little hinge real quick. And I'm just going to set my 3D cursor back to 0 again. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring in yet another good old cube, right? With this new cube, sort of starting fresh, I'm going to switch into edit mode. We worked with edit mode pretty extensively last time in class. That's basically allowing us to go in and manipulate edges and points and faces and everything like that. To get there, we just hit tab. or we can hit the little drop-down menu at the top and toggle between object and edit modes. So in edit mode, one thing I'm going to do, which is again a quick refresh on something we did last time, is I'm going to right-click on this object, and I'm going to choose Subdivide. Subdivide, of course, will take the faces of that object and divide them, in this case, in half. So now I have sort of 4 faces on each surface as opposed to just 1 face per surface like I had before. Just like with adding an object into your scene, the moment you subdivide, you have the ability to sort of modify the way that that subdivision works. There's a little menu down at the bottom left-hand corner of your main interface. And within that menu, you'll see that there's an option in here for number of cuts. And we can modify that. I'm just kind of increasing it real fast. We can see that I could take the number of cuts that my object has and maybe increase it to 3. And you can see what that does, of course, to my subdivision is rather than just, 2 faces per side, I now have 4 faces per side because it created additional cuts. And a cut, if you imagine this being like a real life object and you're sort of slicing it or cutting it with a knife, right? It's sort of extra divisions, extra geometry within the model itself. So 3 cuts means 1, 2, and 3, thus 4 different faces per side. The more I go up on that, the further subdivided the object becomes, the more geometry it contains, the more manipulation can take place on the object, and so forth, right? And there's other kind of interesting things you can do to it, adding kind of like fractal or sort of disjointed patterns to things, so it's not a perfectly smooth cube. But in this case, again, just subdividing it a little bit. Now, what I'm going to do once I've subdivided this object is I'm going to kind of break it a little bit, but intentionally so. So all I'm doing is going back to my selection tool, the white arrow, and from this angle right here, I'm going to select my entire object, or at least it seems that way. You'll recall, of course, from week 1 or last week, just because you're looking at an object, just because you click and drag to highlight everything doesn't mean it's actually grabbing everything, right? Like geometry will block, or foreground geometry will block background geometry within your object. So I was able to click and drag and select everything that I could see, but the entire backside of this object currently is not selected. But that's a good thing in this case, because I'm intentionally trying to break this object a little bit. Cool, so I've selected everything in the foreground. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go into maybe my free transform tool. I'm not going to free transform along any one particular axis. I'm just going to be in this object and maybe just kind of try to break it a little bit, or warp it past itself. Let's see, what can I do? Yeah, so notice how when I take it kind of past itself, going down to the point where it essentially becomes inverted from its original self, the geometry gets really weird. Part of it is because, of course, things that weren't selected aren't moving, and the things that were selected are being transformed. So I've kind of taken this object and warped it inside out, and again, just some really strange ways. Like, this object is definitely broken. Now, of course, we should certainly be mindful of how we approach our work and try not to break things. But in general, right, like if it happens, it happens. And occasionally, like, you might have just a small little error somewhere within your project that needs to be addressed. What I'm talking about right now, and what we're getting into, is something called normals. And normals, an easy way of thinking about it is sort of the normal orientation for how a face should appear within a 3D modeling program. A good example of this is a phenomenon that sometimes happens in video games. So I'm sure there's a lot of folks in here who play games. Has anyone in a video game, like a 3D game, ever fallen through the map? Like glitched out, fallen through the map in a game? So what happens when you fall through a map in a game? You see it from the bottom. Yeah, like you see it, so you can see like you fall through. Obviously, you can see the interior of the mountain. Like when you see the interior of the mountain, do you see like all the textures and everything? Do you ever like see kind of through that to like other things that exist above the mountains? Right. I didn't plan a visual example of this, but I'm sure I could find one. Let's see what happens when we just do a search for it. All right, so I mean, this looks like a two. Yeah, that's a good suggestion. That seems like this is like an explanation into it, which doesn't necessarily need to happen. Skyrim, falling through the map in Skyrim. Yeah, this one looks good. So, hopefully this video is safe for class. I haven't vetted it.
You know, if you've got the app, you should join the main.
All right, so something glitches out. There's a whole bunch of like pots and pans. Fall through the map, looking up, and you notice for a brief moment, obviously it reset the character's position, but when he was falling through the map and looked up, you can see some of the objects, but they look weird, right? Like you could tell, okay, there was the room he was in up above with all the clutter that he fell through. You can see sort of this hallway and staircase over here, but the geometry on it looks strange. You know, there's clearly walls missing. Like if you're in the game and you're actually in that hallway and not falling through the map, you're going to see like a textured wall. You'll see the wooden supports and everything too, but you'll see that textured wall. I'm sure the staircase has something underneath it. It's sort of, again, a weird phenomenon that happens when you fall through the geometry in a game world. And the reason why that happens is within most 3D environments, the textures are only designed to present themselves in one direction, right? So you have a face, you have some object, some geometry that has a surface to it, a material, whatever else, and it's designed to be looked at from one direction. From the other direction, it's not supposed to be looked at. And so what ended up happening in this case is I broke this object. You know, it was a nice even cube, and the idea was I could see the outside of the cube. But as soon as I like kind of twisted it inside out, stretched it past itself, things that were supposed to be on the outside are now on the inside, and vice versa. So this object is a little bit wonky. So why this matters, if you were designing a game, if you were building game assets within Blender, and you set this object into Unity or whatever else you're using to kind of compile your game, the normals or the direction that these faces, these geometries are facing would be wrong. And you would get that same glitch that we saw within that Skyrim video a moment ago. Now in Skyrim, like technically the normals were fine, the faces were fine, because when you're in the game world the way you're supposed to be, you're seeing the textures and those surfaces from the correct direction. When you fall through a map and it glitches out, then you can kind of get a glimpse into, you know, what would happen if your things were the wrong way. So in this case, I would face problems with this object just by default. If I were to save this object, import it into Unity, and just plant it into an environment there, by default, this object would be all sorts of whacked out. It would look the way that Skyrim shot did from underneath. The other problem with normals that aren't facing the correct direction is it'll really mess up any sort of 3D printing that you do as well. You could send this over for a print, but the printing, the program that's used to sort of interpolate the model and print it out is looking at those faces and trying to figure out the best way to do it. And if it sees normals that are facing the wrong direction, it's going to most likely break your model as well, unless there's some sort of software built into the printing application that sort of scans and inverts them by default. Sometimes it's a thing, sometimes it's not. But again, this is something that we should be looking out for. Again, this is really broken. Most of the time yours won't be, but it's good to know how to fix this. or at least start to fix it when it happens. This might be broken to the point where it's not even worth trying to fix, to be honest. But we'll at least start the process, pretending that we really, really need this model to work the way it is right now. So what we need to do is, first of all, we should identify our faces and our normals and the direction that they're supposed to be going in, right? So what I'm going to do, again, I'm in edit mode still. And I'm going to go to this little drop-down menu found at the top of my program. So little arrow right here, right next to the Show Overlays button. I click on that. It's going to give me a submenu real fast. And within that submenu, what I want to do is I want to check on the checkbox about halfway down under Geometry that says Face Orientation. And what face orientation does is, and this is something that you'll only want on for, kind of editing purposes. If we go into like kind of our shading mode at the end, it goes away. But when we're in our other 3D views, we can see it. Face orientation is going to give us the ability to see if our faces are oriented the right way or not. If our faces are in blue, they're oriented the correct way. And if our faces are in red, they're oriented the wrong way, right? So let's go ahead and tinker with this a bit. The other thing that we can do when we're in this menu right here is go down to the bottom area of it and do a few things. You'll see that there's at the very bottom of this little drop-down menu, there's a little section for normals. And there's a few icons in here. There's display vertex normals, split normals, and just display normals as it is. We want this third icon, the last one there, where it looks like the line is protruding from the middle of the face itself. And that's precisely what it's going to do. Yes. I'm sorry? Nothing beyond geometry, huh? Interesting. It could be, so you only see up to there. It could be maybe that you just need to scroll down. Like if you're in that menu and you mouse wheel, does it let you get any further? Huh. Interesting. This step isn't like crucial. So if it's not there yet, we can look at that later. And I can help you figure out why that may be.
You need to be
oh, yes, go ahead.
you need to be in edit.
Okay.
Mode.
So the suggestion is perhaps be
You
in
need
edit
to be in
mode.
edit mode, so he's probably in object mode.
Cool. That was the answer. Nice job.
Yeah.
Cool. So the last thing I want to do here is after I've set display normals, I want to bump up that size a little bit. These lines are basically just showing me the direction that things are heading. Or at least how they're supposed to be heading. And we can see that some of them are pointing inwards, they're not supposed to. Some of them are facing outwards, and that's the way that things are supposed to be. So the next thing I want to do, and this is some nice visual aid. Again, we can disable all of this later on. This is just a visual aid for helping us fix this model a little bit and try to get it back in some sort of default shape. Where things are going to work, 3D print and render appropriately and everything like that. So from there, what I'm going to want to do is I'm going to want to switch to my face select mode, because obviously I'm going to need to select some of these broken faces and try to fix them, right? So if I have a broken face and I go up to my mesh menu at the top of Blender, and then down a little ways to normals, one of the options in there is flip. And when I flip those normals, they should hopefully appear in blue. So again, I'm just using face selection mode, clicking on one of the faces that's currently posing a problem. And then once that face is selected, mesh, normals, and then flip. And that should bring things out the right way. And these corners right here are actually a pretty good example of what we should be looking at. And seeing those light blue lines for our normal shooting out really helps us solidify that. we can see that these slightly diagonal surfaces right here and right here do indeed have a line pointing out of them now, which they didn't a moment ago, which means that these normals are indeed repaired, and it's not going to cause any weird glitchiness within my program or wherever I take it to from there. Again, this could take a little while from a housekeeping point of view. I'm just holding down Shift, selecting some of these interior broken faces. And then once I've selected maybe a chunk of them, I can go up to Mesh. I can go back down to Normals and choose Flip again. If I compare the outside, these two are still fine. These interior faces are now correct. And I can kind of just keep going around and working on this a little bit. So I've selected a whole bunch this time, not all of them, but a decent number of them. With those selected, right click, Normals and Flip. And my object is starting to become repaired. I'd sneak a peek down at the bottom here, do the same sort of thing, just snag these faces. Make sure I'm correcting them, mesh, and flip normals. So still a little bit more to go, of course, some in there. I got the whole backside I need to worry about. But we can see that even though this model was really quite broken, and it wouldn't be able to 3D print correctly, it wouldn't look good in Unity or anything like that, we can get it fairly quickly to a point where it starts to act the way it's supposed to. Even though I did kind of turn it inside out and warp a lot of those surfaces, I can correct it and maintain the form of the object as I go. So again, we likely won't be very reckless with our models as we're doing things with them. But there is always a decent chance that we might, while in edit mode, like accidentally, twist something past where it's supposed to, or warp it, past, beyond itself, and create, sort of problems there. We turn off snapping mode, right? So like just by taking a single point of geometry and stretching it out, I can create glitches in that. And maybe that's what I visually want it to look like, but I can, again, still fix some of those issues. So this model, it's messy. There's a lot of flaws in it, and again, I'm not going to try to like fully repair it to the point where there's, nothing wrong, but we can see kind of where we can go with this. And it is always important, I would say, like as we work on a more refined model, to just briefly go in, check to see what the face orientation is for things, and see if there's any problems within the project. If I were satisfied with this, and I've fixed all of the issues, I could, of course, uncheck face orientation. I can uncheck show normals down at the bottom to get my model back into the state that it was in before I sort of started this process. So in a way, it's like debugging your model a little bit. It's like running it through a validator, just to kind of double check to make sure all of those surfaces are facing the right way so that you don't run into problems down the road with your content. We will, of course, visit this again in the future. And again, it'll likely be something that pops up at multiple times. But any questions just at an initial point in terms of dealing with normals and how they work and what we should be looking out for? Cool. Excellent stuff. So let me get rid of this dude real quick and just kind of start. Let me switch back into my object mode. Get rid of that. What I'm going to look at next is something that adds a lot of interesting possibilities to the work that we're doing within Blender, right? Like there's a number of different ways that we can model. We can sort of handcraft things, mold things out of clay, manipulate surfaces and points and things like that. Another thing that we could do is manipulate our objects with modifiers. And modifiers, I guess a good way of thinking about them is sort of like a filter in Photoshop, or a filter within an imaging app like Instagram or whatever. It takes your default thing and changes it to something different. So what I'd like to do here is start to explore some of those modifiers, not all of them. Throw in a cube real quick just to kind of start myself off. zoom out just a little ways, just so I have a little bit of room around me. And once I have that cube in play and highlighted so that it's selected, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go down to this little kind of wrench icon within my side panel right here. So wrench icon, if you mouse over it, it'll say modifiers, which is exactly what we want. And so what I'm going to do is once I click that, I'm going to go up to the add modifier menu at the top and just explore a couple of these right now. Like obviously, as we can see, there are several dozen modifiers all within this menu. I'm not going to painstakingly go through every single modifier, and B, even if I wanted to, like we'd run out of time. So I just want to touch on a couple of them today to get started. And then from there, maybe some of our homework will be to sort of explore this further. So what I'm going to do, the first one I'm going to choose is a modifier called Boolean, which is kind of that second column, 3 down. And it's not going to do anything by default. If you've worked with other 3D modeling tools like Cinema 4D, you may be somewhat familiar with how the Boolean works. And even if you've never used the Boolean modifier, if you think about even coding, it sort of makes sense in terms of what this might do. So from a coding point of view, like a Boolean is sort of like this true-false statement. It's either on or it's off. It's there or it's not. It's true or it's false. And because there's sort of like this binary dichotomy between or in how a Boolean operates, we can leverage that within a 3D space as well. Within a 3D space, a Boolean is basically used to subtract or knock out a chunk of a different object. So what I'm going to do real quick, I've got my cube, and again, the cube has the Boolean on it. I'm going to go in and just add, some different object real quick. Doesn't really matter what it is, just a different piece of 3D geometry. I'm going to add a cylinder to mine real quick. And what I'm going to do for this cylinder is just kind of squish it down and stretch it out. So I've just got a cylinder shooting right out of the middle of this cube. And so once I've done that, and again, it doesn't matter what you have. Like it could be like a cube that's halfway chunked into the other cube or part of a sphere. The one thing I'd say is like, whatever you choose, it shouldn't envelop the entire model. Like it should only overlap with it in a smaller area of the whole. And so what I'm going to do after I take care of that is I'm going to go back and just single click on this, this cube again. So I can access the modifier properties for it. And what I'm going to do is within those modifier properties for the cube, I'm going to go into where it says object. And what I need to do there is I need to select the object that I basically want to subtract from the cube. So in my case, the object that's here, I have a pretty basic scene set up in front of me. I'm going to choose cylinder. It's the only other thing that I can choose, right? At first, you may not notice anything, but what you can do, there's sort of 2 ways you can handle this. What you could do real quick is you can just go up to your scene collection in the upper right-hand corner and hide the cylinder. By hiding the cylinder, what you'll see is you get that Boolean knockout effect from the object where the cylinder was, and all you see left is basically a cube with a hole knocked through it. So it was a pretty easy effect to achieve. Again, we created the cube, we applied a Boolean modifier to it, and then we told the Boolean modifier to be the cylinder. So the cylinder, again, gets sort of knocked out of it. You could do that in different ways as well. We can set it up to intersect. If you set the Boolean operation to intersect, you'll only see the object where the 2 come together, of course. Union kind of fuses them together as one object, bless you. And then again, difference in this case is going to be sort of what we started with, which sort of knocks that hole out of things. So again, it's pretty interesting in how it works. The cool thing is, by default, modifiers are non-destructive, which means that we haven't permanently altered this object yet. If I wasn't really satisfied with any aspect of it, maybe the hole is too small or it's in the wrong position or whatever else, all I have to do is temporarily unhide that cylinder again. It is still its own free-floating object. Maybe what I could do next is sort of manipulate its size and perhaps its position. And because it's still that same cylinder that's acting as a Boolean to the main object, as soon as I go in and just hide the cylinder again, we can see the effect that has on our main object. So the hole's gotten smaller and it's moved to the side as opposed to where it was originally. Where again, I can go the opposite direction of that. I could kind of position it back in the middle, take its scale, and just really, really bump it up, to the point where the cylinder hasn't completely enveloped the cube, but I only see sort of these small outlying areas on the cube remaining. The rest is sort of consumed by the cylinder itself. I'm just going to kind of squish it down because I don't need it to be quite so tall. But now when I go ahead and hide that cylinder again, we can see that the object that I'm left with is kind of still that cube, but it's almost like a couple of shards that are sort of knocked out from what remains. And this is huge, right? Like, this could be used just like some of the tools we used last time to really help us craft new and unique objects that aren't available to us just with simple geometry by themselves. Anytime that you need to knock a hole out of something, in truth, the best thing to do is honestly take a modifier or a Boolean modifier, place some object inside of the thing that you're trying to knock a hole out of, and then just subtract it like we did right here. And again, these objects are still technically separated from one another. What I could do real quick is, we did this last time in class when we were talking about cameras. Remember that we can set things up as parent and child objects. The problem I have right now, if I go ahead and hide the cylinder, let's say I want to do an animation where like the cube kind of moves around the screen. Well, as I move the cube moves. And it's kind of an interesting effect. Like when it passes through that cylinder Boolean, it does like this weird phasing teleport kind of thing. But I kind of imagined that this shape that I have right now, this right here, would move. Like, so those four little pieces are going somewhere together. So the thing we have to remember, of course, is that both elements, the cylinder and the cube, would need to go together if we left it this way. Easiest way to handle that would be to temporarily hide, or unhide, I should say, the cylinder. Click on it once, then hold down Shift and click on the cube as well. And with those two objects selected, just like we did with the camera and the key lights and everything last time, if we hit Command P or Control P on a Windows machine, it brings up a parenting menu. And then all I want to do is I want to set parent to object. And what that should do is make it so that when the cube moves, the cylinder moves with it. And of course, from there, I have to expand it to find the cylinder. But from there, if I hide the cylinder and kind of get back to my default state, I can move the square around and I see the cylinder is moving along with it, even though it is just a Boolean subtraction. And all I did for that was just, again, set the parent object to be the cube, and the cylinder follows it. I'm going to undo a few steps just to get back to where I had it originally, where the cylinder and the cube are two separate things. So one cool thing, as I mentioned, about the modifiers is that they're non-destructive. You can always go back in, change them around, and sort of do something new. However, I'm guessing you'll probably in many cases be to a point where you are satisfied with the appearance of what a modifier does, and maybe you don't need to edit it any further. If that's the case, you can apply your modifier. Once you apply a modifier, it basically doesn't give you the ability to edit it in the future. So it's kind of like you have to commit to it, but it does sort of simplify your environment down a little bit. So for instance, I'm back on my cube. And the two things are not linked together. When the cube moves, the cylinder stays where it was. But what I could do is go ahead and apply that Boolean modifier to things. It'll disappear from my modifier menu because technically it's no longer a thing that I can manipulate. And now if I were to take that, I'm just going to take the cylinder real quick and delete it. By deleting the cylinder, like, it is no longer in my scene collection at all. All I'm left with is the remains of that Boolean object that I created. But it is sort of its own thing. It's not something editable anymore. I guess it would sort of be like in Photoshop, if you wanted to like rasterize text or rasterize some other sort of vector image so that you can use the tools available in Photoshop. You know, as soon as you rasterize that vector-based content, you no longer have access to it as a vector element. It's just pixels. You can still edit it at a pixel level, but you can't go in and like change the spelling or the font size or anything like that. You've sort of committed to that object existing the way it does. And again, there's definitely some benefits to that. If I have this object, I can go into edit mode. I could go in and, you know, change points or faces or whatever else, and I could select those individual elements and do whatever I want to with it, right? So I can go in and I could extrude these kind of middle pieces here if I wanted. And I couldn't do that if I still hadn't applied the modifier, because it would still technically be a cube and a cylinder versus the end result of those two things subtracting from one another. So pros and cons to either direction with things. Does that make sense? Modifiers, or at least one modifier anyway. Cool. So I'm going to get rid of this object. Let me switch back into object mode, delete, start again with another cube. And again, I told you I'm not going to go through every single one of these modifiers, but we'll go through just a few so that we have something to build off of. I've got a new cube, unaffected, unmodified, within my scene. I'm in my modifier menu. I'm going to go to add modifier. And this time what I'm going to do is I'm going to choose array. And this one's pretty interesting. There's a lot of fun stuff we can do with it. So I'm going to choose array. And the first thing that you'll notice if you add an array modifier is it'll kind of look like it added a second cube to this, which technically it did. It just places that cube directly next to the first one, so in some ways it just looks like it's a little bit longer, but it is indeed two different cubes. And there's some settings down here that we can tinker with to modify that. The offset is basically the distance between them. There's two kind of modes. You can either use a relative offset, which is going to be like as a percentage, basically, how far away is one object from the other. So if the relative offset along, in this case, the x-axis is a relative offset of 1, it means it's 100% the distance away from the first one. So like literally right next to it. If I set the relative offset to 2, there would be the width of 2 objects in between those two. So if I, again, went into relative offset, bumped that up to 2, the gap in between these two objects is the size of one additional object. Or I could kind of squish that down a bit and do like a relative offset of 1.5. So the gap in between is half as wide as the width of the object itself. And that's pretty neat. You know, I can get 2, right, like side by side. But if we sneak a peek at one of the modifier properties just a little bit above that, we have the count property, right? And the count property is currently set at 2. If it's not completely obvious, the count property is going to be how many times that array duplicates itself. Right now there's 2. If I bump that up, I'm just clicking and dragging to scroll. I can increase and decrease the number of objects that appear within this simulated array. And they're all going to be duplicates with the same properties as the ones before. So they're all going to be the same size, of course, and they're all going to have that same width in between them. So we can kind of go off into the void and you know, have this trail on forever if we wanted to. Right now I've got a count of 100, just to kind of keep it a little bit more simple. I'm going to drop that down to a count of 10 right there. And the one thing to note when I was doing this, I was offsetting along my x-axis. So, you know, it stretches them off in one specific direction. If I went in, not that one, oops. If I went in and tinkered with the other values, I can offset them in those directions as well. So, you know, I could offset it perhaps by 1.5 on the y, and I can offset it by, you know, maybe 1.5 on the z. And so my object will kind of go off in whatever direction I've told it to. That's a pretty interesting effect. It's not completely within our control. Well, I mean, I guess it is, but it maybe doesn't do everything we would hope it would. But, you know, we can have things move off in multiple directions all at once. I'm going to undo some of those steps. That way I just get back to sort of my initial view of things real fast. So I've got an array that goes 10 deep on one axis. What if I wanted to create 10 rows of 10, though? It doesn't seem like there's an option to do that within the element the way it is. The interesting thing about modifiers is you can apply multiple modifiers to one single object. So what I'm going to do next, now that I've got basically a row of 10 right here, I'm going to go back up to add modifier at the top of this little menu, back to array, and you can see what happens when I add another array. It basically tacks on like an extra 10 at the end, which kind of works, but not exactly the way I wanted it to be. So what I'm going to do instead, once I bring that back in, I'm going to take my offset value for this and just bring it back to 0. So the first thing I've done is I've taken that extra 10 and just brought it back to 0. Now that I've brought those 10 back to 0, I'm going to offset them a little bit on the other axis, right? So I'm just going to take that new row that's at 0 on my x-axis, 0 offset, and I'm going to give it a y offset of either positive or negative 1.5. Right? So now I have basically 2 rows of 10 within this, and that's what was created. So the first modifier created 10, and now what I could do with this new modifier is I can create 10 rows, right? Or I guess 10 columns in this case. So the last thing I'm going to do here with that modifier is bump up the count of that second modifier to 10 as well. So again, first I created 10 rows, and then I had an additional modifier that's going to create 10 columns of those 10 rows, right? So I now have 100 perfectly spaced objects, all based off of that one individual 3D model. And if I wanted to, I could do the same thing again. I could go in and I could go create, I have to scroll all the way up. I can go in and add one additional modifier on top of that using arrays, right? Now, if I add that modifier on top of things, it's going to duplicate what I just made, and it's going to, as you can see again, set it off at the end there. Just like before, the first thing I'm going to want to do is take that new grouping and take its x offset and bring it back to 0. So again, it's that new group is basically right on top of the old one. But now what I could do with that new group of 100 directly on top of the first one is I can offset it on the z-axis now and have it exist above my other 2. We can see where this is going, and then I can just replicate that as many times as I want. So now that my first, or my duplicated chunk of 100 is perfectly overlapped on top of the original, I'm going to do a z offset of 1.5 again. Let me get that perfect. And again, now I have 2, I guess, sort of layers of these 100 cubes, one on top of the other. zoom out a little ways just so I can see all of this. Just like with the other two modifiers, if I were to increase the count of it, the more I add, the more essentially layers it's adding. Because it's basically another modifier on top of the ones that were already there. So, you know, I did 1 times 10, and then 10 times 10, and then 100 times 10 to create this pretty interesting looking array of elements, right? Like doing this by hand would be incredibly painstaking and probably take hours of like this perfectly aligning all of these elements. I mean, yeah, we can copy paste, so we'd probably be able to, you know, exponentially increase our efficiency as we get like 1 row manually done and 1 column manually done. But if I wasn't talking through this process, if I was just told like, hey, make an array of a 10 by 10 by 10 of cubes, right? Using the array modifier, like it's less than a minute of work if you're just like doing it, which is pretty cool. And again, this is all non-destructive. So if I wanted to increase this, I could, right? This could make your computer chug a little bit, but let's make it a count of you know, maybe 100 on each of these, right? Let's see if 100 times 100 times 100 is 1,000,000. Let's see, hold on. 100 times 100 is 10,000. Yeah, 1,000,000, right? So 100 by 100 by 100. Oh yeah, here it goes. It froze on me for a minute, but right, like now I have this ultra massive array of cubes. Can't hear my computer fan, but it's probably not too happy. But again, that was incredibly quick. And obviously trying to build this by hand would take many, many hours. And we were able to do it in just a matter of seconds using modifiers, right? Let me bump that back down to just the tens. That's excessive. And again, what's cool from there, right? Like this is just, again, a series of layered modifiers. What if I were to add another UV sphere into my object, right? Just like another circle. Right now it's pretty small, but let's bump that sphere up. Let's make it maybe scale-wise, it'll be 10 times bigger on each dimension. Or actually, maybe we'll do 20 times bigger on each dimension. I'm gonna take this sphere. You can probably already see where I'm going with this. Take this sphere and sort of just nestle it into the grid that I'm making. Just gonna get it positioned like so. I check all the sides to make sure it's somewhat balanced. Okay. So of course now I have a cube or a sphere inside of this cube array thing that I built. Why don't I go back to that cube array, go to its modifier properties, and add yet another modifier. I'm going to go in and add the Boolean again. So I've applied a Boolean modifier to my cube. And so now I'll scroll down to the bottom of this modifier menu to find the Boolean. Of course, like last time, I need to set the object that's going to be subtracted from this Boolean array. So I'm gonna hit that drop-down menu, choose the sphere. Now, of course, since the sphere is being subtracted from that 10 by 10 by 10 grid, I could go back up into my menu, and just right now, I can hide the sphere. And all I'm left with, of course, is the remains of that object. And what's cool about it is even on the interior, it sort of naturally completes those faces. We can see that even in the little chunks that got cut off, they have a flat surface to them. I can't edit them yet because I haven't applied these modifiers. But if I did apply those modifiers, this object would just be a thing. And I can go in and manipulate any face of it that I wanted to. or anything else. And so again, trying to model this by hand, forget it. Like it would take so long to do and be like next to impossible to get it geometrically perfect like this. We're able to do that relatively quickly just by using modifiers to create sort of an interesting effect. And there's a whole bunch of other ones too, right? Like I can add yet another modifier and choose beveling. And what that should do is apply, let's see, scroll down to it. Where do I want to be with that? I might need to switch the direction of things, or the order they appear in. Ooh, we're almost out of time too. Well, we can add more modifiers to this. We are, again, very close to the end of class. Thanks for your patience. There is a design challenge / homework assignment for tonight. Some things I didn't quite get to in class. Those will be scooted and will become a tale for another day. It's sort of the dilemma of a new class. Sometimes I have an idea and it's like, oh, we didn't get to that today. So if you currently have Canvas open, there'll be two things about creating a camera fly through for your previous homework assignments. We'll get to that on Thursday. It just gets us back into animation and what we sort of briefly started talking about today. So don't sweat that. But again, we'll revisit next time around. There is a formal homework assignment, which most of it still remains intact. It does say something about doing like a little animation within it. You don't have to, because we didn't talk about that thoroughly. What I'd like everyone to do is create sort of an abstract geometric form based off of these modifiers. And so these are, again, sort of just a couple of examples that are out there, just abstract and weird populations of various 3D objects that create an interesting aesthetic once they're completed. These are, again, just a few things that I found out in the ether, right? It's like this would be like arrays, but you can apply an array with a spiral and then duplicate that to create kind of these like almost rope-like or helix-like shapes off of kind of simpler models that exist beneath. Somewhat randomized duplication of various flat surfaces. This one looks like they all have like rounded edges to them also. This, I think you could probably create out of something similar to what we just did, where like you do a knockout, but like it would be, you would have a sphere that has like a triangular array subtracted from it. And then on the inside of that sphere is another sphere that's subtracted to kind of create the hollow interior, right? Like hopefully that makes sense from an explanation point of view. But I want you to get weird. I want you to play with modifiers, and I want you to see what kind of odd geometric things you can create. The thing is, again, we only talked about like 2.5 modifiers today during class, and there's, you know, easily 3 or 4 dozen more. What you'll want to do for this homework assignment is explore these modifiers on your own, or find some tutorials that sort of help guide you along the way and provide an explanation for, you know, for instance, you know, what does the skin modifier do? Or what does the multi-resolution modifier do? Or the mirror modifier do? Or the mask modifier? Like, what are these? What do they do? What is the lattice modifier? The hook modifier? So that you're exploring on your own in addition to what we're covering in class. So again, create a weird, abstract, geometric kind of amalgamation out of these modifiers. It's up to you to kind of explore it on your own and come up with something weird and funky. There is no animation portion to this required, so you can ignore that piece. We'll talk more about that next time in class. So with that, it is 12:27. Thanks for sticking around and paying attention. And I will catch you all on Thursday. Cheers. And I have a meeting in 3 minutes. I'm going to be late for that meeting. Fortunately, it's on Zoom. But I don't have a ton of time to chat right now. If anyone really needs me to debug like more complex issues, maybe we can find a time to do it a little bit later today, or perhaps tomorrow during office hours. So if it's quick stuff, hit me up. If it's lengthier, let's schedule a time later on. Cheers.
Hey, Ian, really quick question.
What's up?
Yeah, so I had more trouble getting the orthographic town assignment done than I anticipated.
Okay.
I know that there's not really like an extension option for the assignments, but if I want to continue working on it, is there any potential I could get some credit back?
Of course. So there's a number of facets to that. Like, yeah, we got to follow the rules, of course, and deadlines and blah, 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 blah. And mainly, I don't want you to like fall behind. But if you just need like an extra day, that's a courtesy that I would extend to anybody. So keep working on it. Let me know. As long as it's within like a day or two, we're good. And as long as it doesn't become a habitual thing, it's not something that I would ding you or anybody else for. So yeah, don't sweat it right now.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Of course, yeah. Catch you later. What's going on?